I want to read from Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, please. This is one of a group of sermons that I plan on the Sermon on the Mount. In the mornings, we've been talking about the book of James, and in the evening, we've been talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And so here in this passage, Jesus tells us something about where we ought to store important things. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be filled with darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Well, when we stop and think about that passage, there's a great, great lesson in it for us, because it tells us something about what's important in life and what we ought to do with the important things of life. We have to identify what are our treasures. Different people have different kinds of treasures. I know a lady who spent a great deal of money, I mean thousands and thousands of dollars, buying jewelry, rings, and watches and things like this. And these she treasured a great deal. I know other people who buy expensive paintings, and they treasure those paintings a great deal. Some people buy antiques, and they treasure those antiques very much. But you know, things that are very valuable to us, we want to protect. Things that cost us a lot of money, we want to protect in some way. And so every once in a while, as you go down the road, you'll see a little sign in the person's front yard that this property is protected by such and such a company. ADT or various other companies have these kinds of services. Well, you know, we have to treasure the things that we can afford. You know, I can look at something and I can say to myself, "Oh wow, I'd really love to have that." But then I look at my bank account and I say, "Oh yes, but." I remember when Betty and I had been married a few years, my sister and her husband, they bought a boat. I love boats. And I thought to myself, "Betty, why don't we buy a boat? Keep up with my sister, you know. Why don't we buy a boat?" And she didn't say this, but what she said, she really meant, look at the bank account, and you'll see why we can't buy a boat. Well, somehow or another, there are things that are very important to us. I drive a Honda. You know why I drive a Honda? 2 or 3 reasons. One reason is I can afford it. You know, one reason I don't drive a Rolls Royce? Well, first of all, I don't care to have one, but I can't afford it. And so Jesus says there are some things that are very important to us. There are some things that are very valuable to us. And in the ancient days, those things were different than they are now. In the ancient days, they didn't have stockbrokers, and they didn't have companies that specialized in retirement plans and things like this. They didn't have those things. And so when people really made it, what do they do with their money? Well, they did a variety of things with it. One thing that they did with it, they bought very expensive clothes. And that was one way that they showed I'm very successful. It's by the clothes that I wear. And so Jesus says, hang on just a minute, hold it just a minute. Don't let your treasure be something that moths can come in and destroy. Other people would buy, would take the grain and some of the produce, of their farms when they've been very, very successful, and they would store that grain and keep it. Well, that's good. We got to do that. And Jesus used an interesting word here, where moth and rust do not consume. The Greek word that is translated rust at this point, by the way, this is the only place in the New Testament where that word is translated rust. But the word also meant something that eats away on something else. And so some of the commentators say that in that day and time, it may very well Jesus may very well have meant that rats and mice that eat up your grain. And so that may have been a very realistic thing for him to talk about in reference to these particular people. So it said, where moth and rust do not consume. While I was preparing this lesson, I was reading this and I thought of Achan. You remember that story when the city of when the city of Jericho was destroyed, the walls fell down, just as a great story. God said, this is a devoted city. Do not take any of the spoil. Well, old Achan just couldn't quite resist. He saw a very expensive garment. This would be something that the Babylonians would collect as a demonstration of their wealth. Saw a very expensive garment, a Babylonish garment, and he stole it. Why? Well, because this says something about the wealth of a person. This is something that's real important to him. So the first thing we've got to do, I think, is we've got to decide within ourselves, what is really important to me? What is it that really I treasure? Well, he gives three pictures here. I've already spoken of them. But he gives three pictures here. First of all, he says, your real treasure ought to be something that moths cannot eat up. Your real treasure ought to be something that rats can't eat up or rust cannot consume it. Your real treasure ought to be something that's stored in a safe place. So now, with those guidelines in mind, what do we treasure? In Luke chapter 12, Jesus gives us an interesting story. I've always liked the way this story starts out. This is the parable. It's called the parable of the rich fool, usually. And he starts off by saying, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses. And yet, isn't that our culture? Isn't that our society? Why, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, the one who died with the most stuff wins. You remember that? The one who died for the most stuff wins. And the whole idea is get stuff. Get things. And Jesus says, hold it a minute. A man's life is not really what he's worth monetarily. A man's life is not how much he has in material goods. What is it, Lord? I want to tell you a story. He said, once upon a time, there was a man, and boy, he was a farmer, and he had bumper crops. And, after it just looked like everything was just going so well, and this fellow says, wow, I don't have a place to store all this stuff. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down my barns, and Jesus told this story. I'm going to tear down my barns, and I'm going to build big barns. I'm going to build big barns. And then I'm going to sit back in my easy chair, a recliner, and I'm going to recline, and I'm going to say to my soul, you have much good laid up for many years. Eat, drink, be merry. He had it made for it. He had it made in the shade, just like this. And he had everything that his heart could desire. He had everything that culture works for, that society admires. He was successful. People would look up to him. And Jesus says, hold it just a minute. I got something to tell you, guy. Hold it. Jesus introduced this part of his statement with a very severe thing. He says, you fool. You fool. If I remember correctly, this is the only time that Jesus used that word that we have record of. And he says, you fool. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to die tonight. And then all this stuff you've got, whose is it going to be? Well, the rich man's conclusion was, I will say to myself, I'm all set for life. God's conclusion to it was, you're a fool. You're going to die tonight. And then whose will all of these things be? And then Jesus says, this is the way it is for a man who is poor toward God. But the person who is rich toward God is the person who is storing up for himself, as Jesus says, treasures in heaven, not treasures on earth. Well, right away somebody goes say, oh, well, the Bible teaches that money is evil. And as a matter of fact, how many times have you heard the expression, money is the root of all evil? I remember, probably very few of you remember this. Remember the Andrews sisters? The Andrews sisters were three sisters, and they had a singing group. And that one of their songs was, money is the root of all evil. And this is the way people have seen this passage in the Bible. But the Bible doesn't say that, folks. What does it say? The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, I don't have to have a nickel in the bank or a nickel in my pocket to love money. It isn't how much you have, it's the love of money. The Bible never says it's wrong to be wealthy. It doesn't say it's right to be poor. It doesn't address that. Because, you see, my character, what I am inside, who I am inside, that's what makes the difference. What I have or don't have, that's not the important thing. And so, well, for example, Abraham was a very wealthy man. Jacob was extremely wealthy. And there are a number of people all through the Bible like that who were people of great wealth. There's nothing wrong with that. Because, you see, money can be used for good or evil. Have you ever thought about your telephone is a very evil thing to have? It's a very evil thing to have. Did you know that people have plotted murders on telephones? Did you know people have plotted robberies on telephone? Did you know that people have plotted just about every evil thing you can think of by using the telephone? Therefore, the telephone is the The telephone is not evil, is it? The telephone also has saved lives. The telephone also has been used to plan peace. The telephone has been used for all kinds of good things. The telephone is neither good nor bad. It's how I use it. That's what makes it good or bad. And so it's very unfortunate that our culture has said to us that that wealth is bad, that the Bible teaches that wealth is bad, and yet success is measured by so many people in how much we've accumulated, how much we've got, how much we have in the bank, how many stocks or bonds that we have, or how much is our estate really worth. Well, Jesus made a statement. There's an interesting background to this statement that I just want to mention. You remember the feeding of the 5,000, particularly in John chapter 6? After he fed the 5,000, by the way, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell about this part of it. John does. After he had fed the 5,000 and he crossed over the lake, the people came to him and they were very anxious to see him again. And Jesus says, hold it, guys. You're interested only in another meal. He said, do not work for the food that perishes. But he says instead, work for the food that endures to eternal life. It's so easy to get our treasures mixed up, isn't it? Our treasure is not something in a chest somewhere that's full of gold coins or something like this. Our treasure is up here. Our treasure is in our mind. Our treasure is in our heart. What is ultimately valuable to me? And then Jesus made this statement, where your treasure is, what? There will your heart be also. Yeah, you see, my treasure is what is valuable to me, and that's something in my mind. And so Jesus says there's a real tie here between what I treasure in my life and what's in my heart. And so he says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. In the 6th chapter of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told them about worry. Don't be anxious about this. Don't be anxious about that. And in this, he chose a couple of very, very important things, like food and clothing. He says, don't be anxious what we shall eat or how we will be clothed. And after he had gone through this whole thing, it's so easy to say, don't worry, when I don't have any worries, It's so easy to say, no, I don't worry. But then when worries come along, yes, I do worry. And, it's a very difficult thing to lick. And so Jesus says, don't be anxious. Don't allow yourself to become all tied up over things, because a man's life doesn't consist of the abundance of things. And so he ends this little pericope by saying, seek first. Seek first. That's an important word. Seek first what? Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Well, that's just a real important idea, because you see, there are so many distractions. There are just so many things that make me want things. That there are so many allurements, and wow, you look at this stuff on television, and you just got to have this. That's all there is to it. Everybody on your block has one of these, and all of your friends have one of them. You need one too. And they create all kinds of desires in our minds. And so, I've got to spend money on this, got to spend it on this, got to buy this. Why? Well, because I want things. And Jesus says, hey, listen, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all of these things will be added to you. He's not saying you're going to get rich if you seek God first. He isn't saying that. He's saying priorities. Let that be the number one thing, God and his kingdom and his righteousness. And so I have to stop and think for a moment about what is most important then in my life. And immediately you're seeing there's a whole lot of overlapping in this whole thing, isn't there? Because so much of it comes back to such things as, what is my treasure? Where is my heart? What are my priorities? Well, it's a hard question to answer. If this were a class, we're all sitting down here together, and I said to the class, what is the most important thing in your life? What is the most important entity in your life? Well, you see, it's a Bible class, so they're going to give you a Bible answer, okay? And right away, God is the most important thing in my life. Church is the most important thing in my life. Christ's atonement is the most important thing in my life. Well, Probably because we're a Bible class. The most important thing in my life, I'm going to spend more time with it. I'm going to spend more of my energy with it. If it's all that important, let me give you an illustration. My wife and I had 4 children. So far as people are concerned, those 4 children were the most important people in our lives. And you know what? Because they were important, we spent time with them. We spent money on them. We trained them. We helped them. We did all kinds of good things for them. Why? Because they're our children. They're our children. And so the treasure that we have, the priority that we have, this is a hard question to face, because so much of my energy goes to satisfy other things. The things that Jesus says your life doesn't depend on. Your life is more than things. And yet, I spend a lot of time on things. So what about these priorities? Well, God's the most important one in my life. How do I treat Him? How do I treat Him? Well, I pray every day. I usually pray the same thing every day. I've got it pretty well memorized, and so just before I go to bed, I'll go through my prayer. Let me try that on a little different thing. I work at a factory. I work at a factory down in the industrial area, and I come home. I get off about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I come home to my wife. And when I come home to my wife, I've got a standard thing. I walk in and I say the same thing to her every night when I come in. I said, "Hello, honey. I'm sure tired. What's for dinner tonight? Would you get my slippers and my robe?" Next time I come in next time, "Hello, sweetheart. I've had a really tough day today. What's for dinner? Would you get my slippers and my robe?" The next day I come in, "Hello, sweetheart. I'm really tired. I've had a rough day. What's for dinner?" You know what I mean. Well, of course not. No, nobody thinks of a happy home like that. Is that the way we treat God? I've got this little prayer memorized. I say exactly the same thing. I don't even have to think about it. And you know, and I'm all through it. Amen, and I go to bed. And that's it. I'm trying to get us to see that God has to be a treasure for us. And we don't treat people that way. Why do we treat God that way? If we love God the way we say we love God, and if God is the most important one in our whole lives, why is it that we have to beg people to be faithful to Him? Why do we have to beg people to give their time to Him? Why do we have to beg people to give study to the Bible? You see, it's a hard question sometimes for us to answer. It certainly is not. It's not a very joyful question for us to answer sometimes. Look at the time and the thought and the planning that we give to temporal things. Paul said to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, says, "While we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen, because the things that are seen are temporal. The things that are unseen are what? They're eternal. They're eternal." How much of my time, how much of my work, how much of my planning, how much of these things do I give toward God? Well, my treasure and my heart. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I'm not trying to say was certainly not trying to say that, I do certain works and God marks it down in the book. I do other good things, God marks that down in the book. And the first thing you know, I've got a book that's got a whole bunch of good stuff there in it. No, that isn't what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, I want your heart. I don't just want the things of your life. I want your heart. When Betty and I married, that really was the idea. We gave ourselves to each other. She belonged to me, and I belonged to her. And so, when we become Christians, there's a song that says, "For I am His, and He is mine." We belong to each other. Why don't we treat Him as if He belonged to me and I belong to Him? Why can't we fall in love with the one who created love? Well, we've got all kinds of things going. We've got I'm really busy. I've got so many things. I've got my work. I've got my family. I've got this going. I've got this going, and so forth. There's an interesting story in the 20th chapter of 1 Kings. We don't know exactly who the prophet was right here. It speaks of him as the sons of the prophet, one of the sons of the prophets. This usually was a prophet in training, as we would call him. And the king was going to be coming down a certain way. And so when the king came down, this prophet ran out to him. He says, Your Highness, I guess that's the way we call it today. Your Highness, I have something I have to tell you about because I've got a problem. Oh, what's your problem? Well, you see, and when the battle was going on, there was an enemy captured, and they turned that enemy over to me, and they said to me, "Now, don't let him escape. Your life for his life, okay?" And he says, "I was just busy doing a bunch of stuff. I was busy here and there, and lo and behold, he escaped." And he says, "King, help me." And the king said, "You've already condemned yourself." Said, "Your sentence, you've already pronounced your own sentence." Well, your sentence, said the king of Israel, has been pronounced by you. Folks, we ever get busy here and there and let the important things go? We've got this doing, and this going, and this going, and that going, and I forget about the important things. I forget about the eternal thing. And so Paul said, we don't look at the things that are seen. We look at the things that are not seen. Because the things that are not seen, they're eternal. The things that are seen are just temporal. They're passing. They'll be out of the way one of these days. But the things that are not seen, those things are eternal. Oh, there's so many distractions, aren't there? It's so easy to get sidetracked. It's so easy to be busy here and there and lose track of the really eternal, important thing. So where do we store? Where do we store the valuables? We store them where moth and rust do not consume, where thieves do not break through and steal, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So work for God. Make time for God. Give God really the first place in your life. That's what He wants from me. That's what He wants from you and for all of us. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you're subject in any way to the invitation of Christ, we want you to respond tonight. Let's stand together and sing.